April 28, 1945. British processing station, Lüneburg, northern Germany, 1640 hours. The canvas tent smelled of disinfectant and damp wool. Outside, truck engines idled in the mud. Inside, 23 women sat on wooden benches, shoulder to shoulder, silent. Their faces were pale beneath grime and exhaustion. Their hair hung lank. Some still wore the remnants of uniforms, grey skirts, torn blouses, but most had wrapped themselves in whatever they could find. Blankets, coats too large, scarves knotted at the throat. They had been told to wait. No one said, for what? A British corporal entered, clipboard in hand, flanked by 2 female nurses in khaki. He cleared his throat. The women stiffened. One near the back began to shake. The corporal looked at his notes, then at them, and said in slow, careful German, "You will be examined, medically, then issued clothing and assigned quarters." A woman in the front row, small, dark-haired, no older than 22, stood abruptly. Her voice cracked as she shouted, "We won't take our clothes off!" The corporal blinked. The nurses exchanged glances. The woman's hands were fists at her sides, trembling. Around her, others began to murmur, some nodding, some weeping. The corporal raised one hand, wait, and stepped outside. 2 minutes later, a British medical officer entered. Captain Helen Morrison, 41 years old, grey streaks in her auburn hair, a stethoscope around her neck. She looked at the women without pity or contempt. She looked at them the way a doctor looks at patients. She spoke in German, clearly and without haste. "You will not be forced to undress. You will be examined only as much as you consent to. If you need medical care, we will provide it. If you do not, you will be given clean clothes and a place to sleep. That is all." Silence. Then, from the back, a whisper. "You mean it?" Captain Morrison met the woman's eyes. Yes. They expected orders. They were given choices. If this moment already shifts how you see the war, subscribe. The next will surprise you even more. The women had come from a place that had no name on any map. It had been called, in Wehrmacht records, Front Bordel 27, a mobile brothel attached to the 6th SS Mountain Division, moved from Poland to France to the Ardennes, and finally to northern Germany in the collapsing days of the Reich. Most of the women inside it had not volunteered. Some had been recruited under false promises of factory work. Others had been conscripted from occupied territories, Ukraine, Poland, Belarus, and given a choice between servitude and starvation. A few, the youngest, had simply been taken. By April 1945, the division was in retreat. The brothel was abandoned during a chaotic withdrawal near Lüneburg. British forces found it 2 days later. A converted farmhouse with boarded windows, straw mattresses on the floor, and a ledger listing names, ages, and assigned days. The women inside were malnourished, lice-ridden, and terrified. They had been told what the Allies did to women like them. They had been told to expect no mercy. When the British soldiers arrived, the women barricaded the door. The processing station was a temporary facility, tents, cots, field kitchens, set up to handle the flood of displaced persons and POWs streaming west ahead of the Soviet advance. Captain Morrison had been there for 3 weeks, treating everything from frostbite to typhus. She had seen horrors, but the women from Front Bordel 27 unsettled her in a different way. They weren't soldiers, they weren't collaborators in any meaningful sense. They were survivors of a system that had used them until it no longer could. Morrison set up the medical examinations in a separate tent, screened for privacy. Each woman was called in alone. Morrison explained the process in German, a check for lice, wounds, signs of disease. No forced disrobing, no male staff. The women could refuse any part of it. The first woman, Anya, 19, from a village near Kiev, sat on the edge of the examination table and wept. Morrison waited. After a long moment, Anya said, "I thought you would hurt me." "We won't," Morrison said. "Why not?" "Because that's not who we are." Anya looked at her, searching for the lie. She didn't find one. She allowed the examination. Morrison found evidence of malnutrition, untreated infections, bruising in various stages of healing. She treated what she could, documented the rest, and gave Anya a bar of soap wrapped in wax paper. Anya held it like it might vanish. "What is this for?" "For washing." "I can keep it." "Yes." Anya began to cry again. By evening, all 23 women had been examined, treated, and issued clean clothing. grey wool dresses, undergarments, thick stockings and brown canvas shoes. They were moved to a barracks tent with cots and blankets. A portable stove kept the space warm. Dinner was brought in at 1900 hours. Stew, bread, tea. One of the nurses stayed nearby, seated at a small table, writing reports. She didn't speak unless spoken to. The women ate slowly, tentatively, as if the food might be taken away. No one said much, but when the meal was finished and the plates cleared, one of them, Katia, a blonde woman in her mid-20s who had once worked as a seamstress in Warsaw, approached the nurse. "What happens to us now?" she asked in halting English. The nurse looked up. "You'll be transferred to a camp for processing, then likely repatriation depending on where you're from. And if we have nowhere to go?" The nurse paused, then said, "Then we'll find something." Katia nodded and returned to her cot. That night she wrote in a scrap of paper she'd been given with the soap, "They fed us. They did not touch us. I don't know what to believe anymore." The camp they were transferred to 3 days later was located in Westphalia, a converted manor house surrounded by barbed wire and patrolled by British military police. It housed over 200 women, POWs, displaced persons, collaborators awaiting trial, and others whose status was unclear. The women from Front Bordel 27 were classified as auxiliary detainees, a bureaucratic term that meant, "We don't know what to do with you yet." They were assigned to a dormitory on the second floor, a large room with rows of iron beds and tall windows that let in cold spring light. The floors were wood, swept clean. The beds had mattresses, thin but real. Each woman was given a pillow, 2 blankets, and a small wooden locker for personal items. It wasn't freedom, but it was order. The camp commandant was a British major named Geoffrey Preston, a career officer in his 50s with a deliberate manner and a reputation for fairness. He addressed the new arrivals on their first morning, standing at the front of the dormitory with an interpreter beside him. "You are here because the war has ended, and we must determine where you belong," he said. "You will be housed, fed, and treated according to the rules of the Geneva Convention. You will not be harmed. You will not be exploited. If you have concerns, you may raise them with the staff. That is all." He left without waiting for questions. The policy that shaped the camp had been drafted in London in 1940, refined through years of trial and error, and formalised in a directive known informally as Directive 12C. Its central tenet was simple: prisoners are soldiers, not slaves. But the women from Front Bordel 27 were not soldiers. They were something the directive hadn't anticipated. So the staff improvised, guided by a broader principle: restraint, security, diplomacy, morality. The 3 pillars that defined British POW policy applied now to women who had been victimised by the very regime that claimed them. The result was a system that, while imperfect, prioritised dignity over punishment. The women were not interrogated. They were not shamed. They were given work assignments, laundry, kitchen duty, sewing repairs, that allowed them to contribute without being exploited. They were paid in camp currency that could be exchanged for small luxuries: extra soap, writing paper, chocolate from the Red Cross parcels. It wasn't justice, but it was something. Daily life in the camp followed a rhythm that became, over weeks, almost soothing. Wake at 0700, roll call in the courtyard, breakfast, porridge, tea, bread with margarine. Work assignments from zone 900 to 1500, with a break for lunch. Free time in the afternoons. Dinner at 1800, lights out at 2200. Anya was assigned to the laundry. She worked alongside 2 other women, scrubbing uniforms in large metal tubs filled with hot water and lye soap. The work was hard, but it was clean. No one touched her. No one made demands. At the end of each day, her hands were red and raw, but her mind was quiet. Katia worked in the sewing room, repairing torn uniforms and stitching identification patches onto new clothing. She was fast, precise, and grateful for the distraction. Once, a British guard brought in a coat with a torn lining and asked if she could fix it. She did. He thanked her. It was the first time in 2 years a man had thanked her for anything. Another woman, Lena, 31, from a village in Belarus, was assigned to the kitchen. She peeled potatoes, washed dishes, and learned to make tea the British way, strong with milk and never without a biscuit if one was available. The cook, a Scottish sergeant named MacLeod, spoke little but always made sure she ate. Once, when she cut her hand on a knife, he bandaged it himself, carefully, without comment. These were small gestures, but to women who had known only cruelty, small gestures were revolutions. There were moments of friction. One afternoon in June, a new arrival, a Ukrainian woman named Olga, who had been with the group since Poland, refused to leave her bed. She had not eaten in 2 days. She would not speak. Captain Morrison was called. She sat beside Olga's cot and waited. After an hour, Olga finally said, in Russian, "Why are you being kind to us?" Morrison, who spoke some Russian, replied, "Because you are people. We are whores. You are survivors." Olga looked at her, eyes red. "What's the difference?" Morrison leaned forward. "The difference is that you are still here, and you deserve to be treated as human beings." Olga began to eat again the next day. If you're seeing this war in a new light, subscribe. The next scene will challenge you even more. By midsummer, the camp had settled into a fragile stability. The women began to talk more, to laugh occasionally, to argue over card games and who got the cot nearest the window. Some received letters from family members who had survived the war. Others learned their families were gone. The camp chaplain, a gentle Anglican priest named Father Denholm, held services on Sundays for those who wanted them. He never preached about sin or redemption. He spoke about endurance. One Sunday in July, Katya asked if she could play the piano in the chapel. There was an old upright in the corner, slightly out of tune. Father Denholm said yes. She played a Polish folk song her mother had taught her, slow and melancholy. When she finished, the room was silent. Then Anya, sitting in the back row, began to cry. Afterward, Katya wrote, "I played for my mother. I think she heard me." The ideological shift was gradual, almost invisible at first. The women had been told the Allies were monsters, rapists, murderers, savages. But the reality they encountered was something else entirely. Order, routine, and a kind of distant but consistent decency. It wasn't warmth, it wasn't affection, but it was respect. One afternoon, a British guard, a young lance corporal named Davies, was supervising the laundry detail when Anya dropped a basket of wet uniforms. She froze, waiting for the blow. Davies bent down, picked up the basket and handed it back to her. "Careful," he said. "They're heavy." That was all. But Anya remembered it for the rest of her life. Another incident. Lena, working in the kitchen, accidentally burned a tray of biscuits. Sergeant McLeod came over, looked at the charred tray, and shrugged. "Happens to the best of us," he said. He showed her how to adjust the oven temperature. He didn't yell, he didn't curse. He taught her. Later she asked him why. "Why what?" he said. "Why are you kind?" He thought about it. "Because we're not them." In August, the camp celebrated the first anniversary of VE Day with a small ceremony. Major Preston gave a brief speech about peace and rebuilding. The women were invited to attend, but not required. Most did. Afterward, there was tea and biscuits in the courtyard. One of the British nurses brought a gramophone and played music. Big band, swing, songs the women didn't know but found themselves swaying to anyway. Katya danced with Anya. Lena clapped along. For 20 minutes, they were not POWs or victims or survivors. They were women in a courtyard on a warm evening, listening to music. By autumn, the first repatriation lists were being prepared. Some women chose to return to Poland, Ukraine, Belarus. Others had no homes to return to. The British government, in consultation with the United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Administration, offered a pathway. Women with no country could apply for residency permits in Britain or emigrate to Commonwealth nations. Anya applied to stay in Britain. She had no family left in Ukraine. She had skills: laundry, sewing, basic English. She was offered work at a textile mill in Lancashire. She accepted. Katya chose to emigrate to Canada. A resettlement program was recruiting workers for the garment industry in Toronto. She left in November 1946, carrying a suitcase and a letter of reference from Captain Morrison. Lena stayed in the camp longer than most, working as a cook's assistant until 1947, when she finally accepted a position at a hospital in Manchester. Sergeant McLeod wrote her a letter. She kept it in her pocket for years. In the winter of 1947, Captain Morrison returned to the camp for a final visit before her reassignment. She walked through the dormitory where the women from Front Bordel 27 had first slept. It was empty now, the beds stripped, the windows open to air out the space. She stood in the centre of the room and remembered the first night, the fear, the defiance, the woman who had shouted, "We won't take our clothes off." Morrison had not known then what the right response was. She had only known what the wrong one would be. She walked to the window and looked out at the courtyard. A few women were still there, waiting for final paperwork, playing cards at a table. One of them looked up and waved. Morrison waved back. If this story moved you, subscribe. Because history isn't just what happened, it's who we chose to be when it mattered. Years later, when historians would study the treatment of displaced women in the aftermath of World War II, they would note the failures, bureaucratic delays, inadequate resources, the women who slipped through cracks, but they would also note the moments of decency, the policies that prioritized dignity, the officers who chose restraint over retribution, the small gestures that said, "You are still human." Anya would live in Lancashire for 53 years, marry a factory foreman, and raise 2 daughters. She never spoke publicly about Front Bordel 27, but in private she would tell her daughters, "I learned what kindness was from a British nurse who let me keep a bar of soap." Katya would spend 30 years in Toronto, working as a seamstress and later as a tailor. She would play the piano every Sunday in a small church on Queen Street. She would tell her grandchildren, "I was lost, and strangers helped me find my way." Lena would work at the hospital in Manchester until retirement, marry late, and live quietly. She would carry Sergeant MacLeod's letter in her purse until it was too fragile to unfold. She would say to anyone who asked, "The war taught me cruelty. The peace taught me that not all men are cruel." The canvas tent is gone now. The camp in Westphalia is a housing estate. The manor house was torn down in the 1960s. But the memory remains, held in letters, in documents, in the quiet testimonies of women who survived and chose to remember, not the worst of what was done to them, but the small dignities they were given when they had nothing left. They had been told to expect monsters. They found human beings. They had been treated as objects. They were given choices. They had been taught that power meant cruelty. They learned that power could mean restraint. Because in the end, civilization is not defined by what we do when we are strong. It is defined by what we refuse to do when we could. The war had taught them fear. The peace taught them mercy.